So, right off the bat, I should probably apologize for the clickbaity title this video is going to have. I just wanted to get people's attention because I'm a gigantic attention whore. That's why. No, I just wanted to talk about organic centralism today. This is a theoretical idea put forth by the left-com theorist Bordiga of the Italian left. He was a contemporary to Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and a lot of other people, and basically led the Italian Communist Party for large amounts of the first half of the 20th century. So that's who he is. Now, what exactly is organic centralism? Organic centralism is the belief that there should be one workers' party to which the principle of democracy is irrelevant, and all its actions are made to destroy capitalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, prevent opportunism in general. And generally, when you hear left comms complaining about opportunism, it could mean anything, but as far as the concrete definition goes, it usually means making compromises with either capitalism as a political ideology or as a set of conditions, or you know the drill, right? I would hope so if you clicked on this video. But let's get on with it. The reason I decided to make this video now is because I finished reading this very short piece by Bordiga, Proletariat, Dictatorship, and Class Party, I believe it was called. It was very short, but I've also read other things of him. I've read On the Democratic Principle. I'm just about halfway through the Lyons thesis, or the Loins thesis if I'm feeling disrespectful, which I am. I'm sorry. But it was very infuriating to read, and Bordiga is one of those theorists. Every time I pick him up, it's like the opposite of Marx. He's only right about like 3 or 4 things, where Marx is only wrong about like 3 or 4 things, you know? His aversion to actually making sense and seeing the world around him and critiquing his own ideology it's pretty incredible, and I'll explain what I mean by that as I dig into this. And I don't want to be too mean to left comms in general. Sometimes that's a problem of mine. And they'll accuse me of being too or not sectarian enough with this, I guess. I don't like being sectarian. I don't like being mean to other people because of X, Y, and Z, even political beliefs. Actions do matter, though. But let me just say this. I really don't like Bordiga. I don't like Bordigists. But I want to put that bias behind me for this video to talk about the actual theoretical things going on in his work and his ideas about the party and proletarian dictatorship. When I do quote things, it'll probably be from Proletarian Dictatorship and Class Party because it's the most concise of the works of Bordiga that I've read and lays out the most concrete ideas, I think. So let's just get right into it. There are basically 2 parts to his critique of democracy, right? And the first one is that democracy is an abstraction because it relies on an arbitrary statistical cutoff, and also because it relies on representation. That also makes it an abstraction. The workers are not representing themselves, and that's a critique that not only Bordiga makes, a lot of anarchists and social liberals make the same critique, but they do it very differently and much more intelligently, I think, and I'll explain why. But so let's dig into the first one of those digs at democracy, that it's arbitrary because it relies on a statistical cutoff, that 50%, 60%, 75%, X, Y, Z number of people need to vote for something in order for it to happen, right? Well, this is the first thing that we should talk about democracy is that that's not what democracy is about at all. Democracy isn't a system of voting. It's not a procedure. It's very clearly and historically been defined as one thing and one thing only, and that's mass rule. The classical definition of like different kinds of government, you have monarchy, which is ruled by one person. You have aristocracy, which is ruled by several people, Then you have democracy, which is ruled by the people, the mass of people, right? That if you go to any classical theorist, you go to Machiavelli, you go to Rousseau, you go to John, you go like through the liberals, go forward to the ancients. This is what they thought democracy was. This is how they defined it. Of course, who exactly is the mass of people? That's been subject to a lot of change over like the popular conception of it anyway, and more theoretical. But let's not get into that. The point is that democracy is not a statistical, arbitrary cutoff. It is just mass rule, and voting can be a way to accomplish that. But it's not like democracy isn't substantiated, isn't legitimized by like 50% or whatnot. It's only a good way I like to put it. Something's democratic if you can credibly believe that ordinary people that had a say in the laws, in the government's actions, and that kind of thing, right? Okay, moving on. So, Bordiga does anticipate this point, right? He does, and he in doing so, he contradicts himself on that account, that he acknowledges, at least implicitly, that democracy isn't just a statistical cutoff, because he even addresses this argument from what would basically be democratic socialists, I suppose. I'm going to quote him here, so I can't be accused of attributing or misinterpreting his position, okay? This is what he says. A century ago in the West, and 50 years ago in the Tsarist Empire, Marxists rightly argued against the simple-minded Democrats that the capitalists and proprietors are a minority, and therefore the only true government of the majority is the government of the working class. If the word democracy means power of the majority, the Democrats should stand on our class side. But this word, both in its literal sense, power of the people, as well as in the dirty use that is more and more being made of it, means power belonging not to one, but to all classes. For this historical reason, just as we reject bourgeois democracy and democracy in general, as Lenin also did, we must politically and theoretically exclude, as a contradiction in terms, class democracy and workers' democracy. So basically, I think that's a load of bullshit. And there's really only two ways you can interpret this. One is that people are mistaking the definition of democracy, or rather that the Bordiga thinks that people are mistaking the definition of democracy. That does not mean democracy of power of the people, but democracy between all classes. That is, people as a whole aren't the ones in control, but there's a power-sharing agreement between classes, basically. Not agreement, but a power-sharing reality between classes is what that one interpretation could be. The other one could be that because democracy is allowing everyone political rights, that it means that the bourgeois will have democracy. They'll be able to vote. So that means that they'll still have influence or power in this democracy. Well, let me ask you this, and let me to show how bullshit that is. We have a system of voting right now. We have a system of so-called representative democracy or republic here in the U.S. and UK and many other places in the world. Do you think workers have power in this system? Do you think they have a credible say in what goes on? Hell no. That's such bullshit. If you think, just look at what's going on around us. How could you possibly come to that conclusion? There's, like I say in a couple videos ago, you can statistically prove that the mass of people do not have power in at least the United States. I'm sure elsewhere as well. But anyway, the other argument, the first one, that democracy leads to a class, what do you call it? Class collaborationism. Well, that whole argument is that, well, people aren't fighting for real democracy. They're fighting for a democracy that just shares a democracy of classes, not a democracy of like the mass of people. Which is, okay, let's not fight for that then. Let's fight for an actual an actual democracy of the people, of the workers in this case, at the majority of people. Let's try that. How about it, huh? And, well, just, if you think that allowing former capitalists to vote. I mean, you can debate on that or not. I think it's a debatable issue. But even if you don't, even if you do you really think that they're going to have power in society? Who has power in a democracy, as we conceive of it? It's not just who votes. This is the primary lesson of Marx and Marxism, that the economic base of society has a great deal of the ideological structure of society. This means who has control over the media, who has control over industry, are much bigger factors than one person's individual vote. If the workers then have control over those things, I don't see how it's any way disputable that it would be a democracy. And I mean authentically have control over those things. So political freedom and democracy are completely compatible, and as I'll explain in a moment, completely necessary for a dictatorship of the proletariat. So long as workers dominate other parts of society, that is. So, yeah, understand that. Let's skip on to Bordiga's other point, that democracy cannot be a dictatorship of the proletariat because it abstractly represents the workers. This is true of bourgeois democracy, because it does have that system of representation. In the U.S. you vote for your congressman, you vote for the president, you vote for X, Y, and Z. You don't actually vote for policies. This is kind of more iffy in places like Switzerland, but generally, like I said, things like the broader mechanisms of society have a big role in these kind of things. So if you don't have control over those, you don't have control over society anyway. Or the world around you. You don't have self-ownership or autonomy, or whether as an individual or a class of workers, right? Anyway, in the more literal sense, politicians have direct control. They're the ones directly pulling these levers of power. And they are people with their own set of specific interests, often developed by, one, the office they hold, and two, by the class warfare in society, the larger institutions, which are usually controlled by bourgeoisie. You hear politicians in the U.S. talking a lot about what local businesses want, what the Chamber of Commerce wants, that kind of thing. That's what I'm talking about. But certainly, workers are capable of debating and creating laws, policies directly. We've seen that happen in many places historically. It is possible. I don't want people to think, the logistics of it. The logistics would be hard, but democracy's hard. Socialism's hard. All of those things are hard. You can't let that deter you. Ultimately, though, I guess the bare minimum of saying there's a credible possibility that the people as a mass have control over their society, over their government, etc., would be to say that, the minimum instrument would be instantly recallable leaders, politicians, those kind of things. Bordiga takes this idea of instant recallability from Lenin, and then he just rams it into the hells of despotism with this just one easy trick. He says that the party, as an organic entity, can simply throw out any opportunists from being involved in this process. So, once again, I will quote, "Without losing time and without procedural whims, it establishes the armed bodies of workers of which Lenin spoke, the Red Guard, the Revolutionary Police. At the meeting of the Soviets, it wins over a majority to the slogan, 'All power to the Soviets.' Is this majority a merely legal or coldly and plainly numerical fact? Not at all. Should anyone, be he a spy or a well-intentioned but misled worker, vote for the Soviet to renounce or compromise the power conquered thanks to the blood of the proletarian fighters, he will be kicked out by his comrades' rifle butts. And no one will waste time with counting him in the legal minority, that criminal hypocrisy which the revolution can do without and which the counter-revolution can only feed upon." I want you to think about that quote for a moment. On its face, it might not sound so bad. We're kicking out all these opportunists and this the counter-revolutionaries. I mean, it's not as though factions and leadership of parties might not have much to gain from this exercise of kicking out people they don't like. It's not as though people will abuse power if they are given the chance. And anyway, why the hell would you hold a vote if you're just gonna kick out everyone who voted against the majority to begin with? Bordiga, of course, has no time for such concerns. To him, no individual political interest can exist. It is simply the Venetian world of the workers and the capitalists, and the state can only be controlled or influenced by one or the other. History tells us this is untrue, and I don't just mean the history of the USSR. There is this thing that appeared in the early theory of Marx and Engels, but which later was revoked, or they stopped talking about it, because it looked like the anthropological evidence of the time spoke out against it. I'm talking, of course, of the Asiatic mode of production. Now, if you'll excuse the Orientalist name there for a moment, it's basically this idea of private individuals, namely kings or some other kind of monarch, were in control of the state, and the state was basically their property, and the state controlled most of production, right? Well, it was assumed at the time that many Eastern countries had this kind of mode of production, pre-capitalism. But as better information came into the West about this, it was very clear that many of these Eastern countries actually just had regular feudalism. But if more modern anthropological evidence has shown that this so-called mode of production actually did exist. There is several cases in India of kingdoms where the state just bought up all of the industry, all of the production, and just worked from there. What it shows, though, is that the state can be beholden to personal interests, to the interests of the people simply in control of it, and not beholden to any particular class outside of the state, right? This is actually pretty similar to what happened in the USSR, and you can still call it capitalism if you like, but the principle of ownership here is the same. To Bordiga, though, ownership and control is only half of the equation for a mode of production, for in particular socialism, right? The other half is centralism, ending the anarchy of production. Well, let's just look at what Marx said about that, about how to end that anarchy of production. He says quite clearly, and I've cited this as well in other videos, that the capitalist mode of production, its system of the law of value, its process of consolidation, will naturally lead to the socialization of production, so that it'll naturally end the anarchy of production itself. You don't need these mass centralizations like Stalin had, for example, or like Mao had, which were done they were very bloody. They caused lots of problems. And we're talking about the agricultural centralization here. But if you look at the U.S., for example, ironically enough, it was I think it was under Reagan's administration, the Department of Agriculture completely centralized all of agricultural production. And there was lots of complaining about it, sure, but there wasn't the kind of bloodbath we saw under the USSR and China. So, that's that. That's one thing to keep in mind in all of this. It's more of a side note. I'll continue with the main argument about democracy. It's very clear that Bordiga envisions a dictatorship of the proletariat to be a one-party, communist party, in particular, state. And I confess I do have also some biases against one-party states. My uncle, who was a communist, and because he was a communist, he was tortured by the pre-party, by their government in Mexico. So that's one more confession of my own. So be welcome to take what I say. Well, actually, don't take it with a grain of salt. I hope you listen, but just know I understand my biases. I'm trying to overcome them anyway. But let's look at what he says about the dictatorship of the proletariat. He says, As the new socialist organization emerges and develops with the party and the revolutionary state in the foreground, it will not limit itself to striking only the former employers and their flunkies, but above all it will redistribute the social tasks and responsibilities of individuals in a quite new and original way. And skipping down a bit, he continues, it is precisely the presence of a single-class state and of a solidly and qualitatively unitary and homogeneous party which offers the maximum of favorable conditions for a reshaping of social machinery that be driven as little as possible by the pressures of the limited interests of small groups and as much as possible by general data in their scientific study in the interests of the collective welfare. The changes in the productive mechanism will be enormous. Let us only think of the program for reversing the relationship between town and country, on which Marx and Engels insisted so much, and which is the antithesis to present trends in all countries. I want you to think on that section for a bit, because on the face of it, it might sound pretty good as well, but it might also remind you of something that we've all found to be rather sinister. And that's neoliberalism of all things. It's this technocratic idea that, we just leave everything to science, to general data, and everything will be fine. We just gotta put the smart people in charge. We've gotta put the smart people in charge of the party, and everything will be okay. We kick out all the opportunists, we kick out all the counter-revolutionaries. We just have a smart Marxist theoretician and scientific party, and we'll be good from there. I would really hope that the sheer despotism of the neoliberal years have taught us something. Have taught us that this it's really the purest ideology. And if you look at Lyon's thesis, I don't know how to pronounce it honestly, but if you look at it, you see this kind of thing again. You see that he's just completely incapable of critiquing his own ideology, even as he says everything else is, that's all ideological. It's like left comms. I know you love Zizek, and I hope you love Zizek, and I hope you take his critiques to heart and apply them to people like Bordiga, because he needs them. Okay, it's because his view of the dictatorship of the proletariat is a post-ideological wonderland. And I understand why this is popular among a lot of people in my circles that are very theory-heavy people who care a lot about Marxist theory and that sort of thing. It's a comforting idea that, if only actual principled Marxists like me, just people like me, not me in particular, of course, had control of, the USSR or something, things would have gone a lot better. They would have actually abolished value form. They would have abolished the commodity production. And you can't, it's the height of lack of self-awareness, of pretentiousness. And I don't want to be mean, because all of us fall victim to this a little bit sometimes. But the logic of if only people like me were in charge, everything would be okay. That's not how you can't do it like that. You just can't. There are other people out there. You have to say that, to believe in it, even subconsciously, it's the highest form of despotism. You see, it's just like saying, the workers are too dumb. They're too opportunistic to be in charge. Only we, the enlightened leaders of the party, can see through idealism and ideology and be in charge. If you can't see the tyranny in that, my God. Bordiga has done a beautiful magician's performance here. He's replaced the abstract of bourgeoisie democracy for the proletariat, the abstract of the proletariat thinking it's being represented, to the party being the same thing. The abstract is no longer the congressman, the Congress. The abstract is now the party. And he can't even begin to address that. And let me just say this. A party of scientists and theoreticians, and they're just all who's in control, the only ones. I can't think of any more brutal and impersonal dictatorship than the reign of such creatures. Be up there with capital. Be close. I don't know which one will be worse. It even reminds me a little bit of the neo-reactionary aspirations of the 100-year Reich of the software engineers. Here's an idea. How about we fight for the actual working class and create a democratic society which actually, not abstractly, puts them in control. To be clear, I don't object to a party being like something what Bordiga describes in a situation of capitalism, although I disagree with some of his ideas of tactics. But certainly, you should be able to determine, and a lot of more European parties are like this, of what the party line is, and you can kick people out who disagree with it. And you can even do that for like revolution. Here's the thing, and he uses the example of Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution a lot, of an example of why they should kick out all the opportunists and stuff. You should keep in mind of just the extraordinary circumstances that the Bolsheviks were in, and I mean, like, okay, yeah, you should kick out people who are being counterproductive to your cause or whatever, but at the same time, like, the sheer level of tyranny and a lot of the not so socialist things the Bolshevik Party had to do was because of like the extreme circumstances that Russia was going through at the moment, the sheer amount of war and destruction, and violence, and chaos. And we shouldn't mistake the actual goings on within that revolution as goals that we have. And I urge you all to go. I'll put it in the links. Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution pamphlet. It's so, you have to read it. I don't want to be pretentious about that. I would highly recommend it. Okay, because it's critiques of Lenin and what would eventually be people like Bordiga is very prescient. It's very important, very relevant to the kind of discourse we're having right now. Because it would be a mockery to call such a post-revolutionary state with such a structure as Bordiga envisions a true dictatorship of the proletariat. And, well, that's my thoughts on that. Another little minor point, something I thought that relates to the pure ideology of his vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is he thinks, we shouldn't have a constitution because that's idealism to think that there's this immutable framework of society, usually divinely inspired or whatever. Look, if you go to the original liberal theorists about this, if you go to, like I always say, Machiavelli, you go to Rousseau, they openly acknowledge that the Constitution isn't an immutable, divinely inspired thing. It's a purely ideological framework, basis, starting point. It almost plays a psychological role in society. And I want you to think for a second. I mean, there's lots of idiots out there. There's going to be lots of idiots out there forever, I think, even in socialism and certainly in the dictatorship of the proletariat. What do you think these people who believe that the U.S. Constitution was divinely inspired, even though, the U.S. founders would never suggest something like that, right? Well, I want you to imagine for a second if all these idiots were being told, no, there's no actual basis for this society we're building right now, or that we're in right now, rather. It's only being held together by pure force. Well, guess what? You're going to have to actually do with pure force what ideology was doing before, which is making all these idiots complacent with the current order of things, which is maybe the abolishment of capitalism, if that's the dynamic system that's going on right then. And that can be very problematic. It probably lead to more revolts, more insurrections, and people forget, and this is another complaint I have with one-party systems, is that when you have just one party, when you have this totalitarian system, and Bordiga openly claims that he wants this with totalitarianism, the reason it's unstable, and it is unstable, is because used in liberal systems, liberal capitalism, a lot of the resistance to the state and to capitalism is dispersed against a lot of different ideological objects, like either the state or the market separately, against the CEOs, against the Jews, the Muslims, whatever, what have you. But when you have a totalitarian system where it's just, or more obviously rather, they'll also blame like the Democrats or the Republicans, right? That's what happens. You vote one out and then you put the other one in. And it has this big whole liberal confusion, this illusion, right? Well, you don't have that in a one-party totalitarian state. What you have is that all the resistance to the current economic order and the state are going right against the communist project, against the communist class party. And that, I think, is a recipe for disaster. Anyway, I want to end on the final paragraph of this article by Bordiga. And it's probably one of the most disappointing and idiotic things I've ever read. Let me quote it for you. They being the communists here, know that a revolutionary and totalitarian apparatus of force and power, which excludes no means, will be able to prevent the infamous relics of a barbarous epoch from rising again. It will only be able to prevent the monster of social privilege, craving for revenge and servitude, from raising its head again and hurling the thousandth time its deceitful cry of freedom. That's right, freedom. That's what we gotta be afraid of. It's not like, oh yeah, the working class, they don't need freedom. Who needs that? Only the bourgeoisie. Only they care about freedom, don't you know? I mean, come on, people. This is, left comes, you supposedly pride yourself on self-criticism, right? Ruthless self-criticism. Here's my challenge to you all, and you're welcome to criticize me for this video, but I hope you do this too. I hope you call out people who advocate despotism like this, who openly advocate for it. And they may claim it's for the working class, but they've just, unless they can prove it's not like some abstraction of the working class, it's not that. It's just despotism. And it will, no matter how firmly you believe in it, it will lead to opportunism. It's not going to happen. You think people with power like that are just going to give it up because even no matter how much it supports them, you don't think they're going to rig the system into their favor any chance they get? I really don't want to believe that you guys are tyrants in the waiting. Just please, for the love of God, prove me wrong. Please, please prove me wrong. Please, please, please prove me wrong. Well, that's all I wanted to say for this video. And thank you for listening if you actually listened to the end of this little piece of shit. I'm just really concerned that so many people might just be consumed with this tyrannical notion that, I don't know, I don't want to see us repeat the mistakes of the past. And it frustrates me. It really, really frustrates me. I hope we can be better. I hope that we can actually come to critique people like these writings and not take without a very large grain of salt any theoretical work, any from Marx to Lenin to Plato. I don't actually critique. Don't hold anyone or anything above yourself, above what you think is right. Hold everything to your own measure. That's what I think. You gotta loot the supermarket of ideology. That's the quote. The supermarket of ideology is like any supermarket, worth only for looting. I hope you take that to heart. All of you. Anyway. Goodbye. I'll talk to you later, and maybe I'll get around to making all those other videos I said I would.